The sea off Okinawa looks almost calm when the warning comes. A thin voice in a destroyer's headphones, crisp and strained, rises out of static. Boogies inbound, many, many boogies. Men in denim work shirts glance up from ammunition hoists. On the bridge, the officer of the deck squeezes his binoculars so hard the leather creaks. In the Combat Information Center, a young radar operator watches his phosphor screen fill with white blips. They are coming from the north and west, from every point of the compass where land and fuel still exist, and they are not turning back. It is April 6, 1945, the first full week of the invasion of Okinawa and the United States. Navy is staring into the largest kamikaze attack it will ever face. The code name on the Japanese side is Kikusui, floating chrysanthemum, a reference both to the imperial seal and to flowers set on the water as an offering for the dead. From a chain of airfields across southern Kyushu and the Ryukyu Islands, hundreds of aircraft are clawing into the morning sky. Some are fighters hastily refitted to carry bombs. Some are aging dive bombers. Some are sleek, fragile Zeros stripped of armor. Many of the pilots have never flown in combat. Each has a flag folded inside his jacket and a letter in his pocket. The promise is simple and absolute. Fly one way, strike the enemy ships, and die. The storm has been building for months, through a sequence of Pacific battles that ground both navies down to bone and tendon. The previous fall, at Leyte Gulf, Japan gambled its surface fleet and lost. In February and March 1945, American Marines, soldiers, and sailors bled their way up the archipelago. Iwo Jima, then toward Okinawa, the last step before Japan proper. The landings on April 1st, the April Fool's Day, that no one would ever forget, placed the U.S. 10th Army on Okinawa's beaches, under a canopy of naval guns and carrier planes. The Japanese had prepared for this moment, not with the kind of fleet action that had once defined the war, but with a dark calculus. Where training fuel and aircraft were scarce, a pilot's life could be turned into a guidance system. If they could not defeat the invasion at sea, perhaps they could wound it into hesitation. It worked this way. The U.S. Navy threw a picket fence of radar out into the ocean, destroyers and small gunboats strung far from the anchorage. Their job was to spot incoming raids, direct fighter cover from carriers and captured airfields, and be the first line of defense. They were also the first and most exposed targets. Farther in, cruisers and battleships formed gun lines around the transports and the hospital ships. The carriers, grouped in fast task forces, kept their distance and their fighters aloft in a ceaseless carousel, a pattern that demanded perfect timing and endless fuel. It was a machine moving at the limit of its own design. If enough kamikazes slipped through, if even a percentage of the hundreds found steel decks and open water, the machine would falter. On Kyushu, at fields like Kanoya, Kushira, Kokubu, and Shiran, the rituals were brief and pragmatic. There were photographs. There was tea or sake if there was any to be had, and white headbands tightened with careful hands. Army air units, the Shinbu Tai, had been formed for this very purpose, operating alongside the Navy's special attack squadrons. Some pilots volunteered, some were volunteered. Others felt the binary loneliness of war closing around them. Their commanders were not acts of myth, but men with maps, tasked with halting an invasion that would otherwise stride toward their homes. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, head of the 5th Air Fleet, spread his assets like lead weights on scale pans. He knew the Americans would meet the first wave with their best and their calmest. He intended to send not one wave, but many. Back at the picket station, miles offshore and alone on the rim of the fleet, the destroyer shakes itself awake. Water barrels in along the cape rail as the helmsman turns into the wind to unmask the guns. On the fantail, the after 5-inch turret trains over the stern, the square shoulders of its shield gleaming with salt. Forward, twin Bofors cannon tilt their barrels skyward. Men throw the metal covers off stacks of 40mm ammunition, loading belts by feel, jamming their rounds into place like they have practiced since boot camp. Below, in a room painted the pale green of Navy sanity, the CIC plotters pin grease pencil lines across a plastic board as radar bearings are called out and fighters are vectored. The lingo is clipped and almost casual, a sailor's habit wrapped around a mathematician's task. They are drawing a map of air and hope. This is a story with an obvious ending. The Allies win the war. The invasion goes forward, but the path through it is not tidy. It is a story about how technology and training face a tactic that is older than both. It is about human beings, on both sides, who wait to their duty and do what that duty requires. It is a story in which young men stare into fire and into the eyes of an enemy that is also a mirror. The first specks appear, riding the morning haze, no larger than ash against the sky. The destroyer's horn begins its ragged song. Over the radio, a controller's voice goes from smooth to urgent. Fighters are streaking out from the carriers and from the raw runways at Kadena and Yantin on Okinawa to meet the inbound mass. Onshore, Marines hear the flak begin, the rolling thunder of the fleet's air defense. In the anchorage, hospital ships switch on their large red crosses with a prayer that the marks will hold. In Kyushu, the last of Kikusui's first wave lifts into air. It will never breathe again. Between the radar pickets and the heart of the fleet lies blue distance and 12 minutes. That is the time in which one side must stop the other. The largest concerted kamikaze attack of the war is about to forge itself against steel and smoke. There will be names, bright for a moment then gone, destroyers you have never heard of, pilots whose faces were once in family albums. There will be numbers that sit like stones in the throat. There will be a day when the sea seems to catch fire. Kikusui was not a single blow, but a pattern, deliberate and relentless, designed to wear down vigilance and saturate defense. The first day, April 6th, threw its full weight at the perimeter and the soft heart of the anchorage. The radar picket destroyers took the initial shock. The destroyer USS Bush, a greyhound of the Pacific that had survived earlier campaigns, was on station when the sky pulled apart. Her gunners, veterans now, had rehearsed the choreography: track, lead, fire, shift, fire again. The sound is mechanical and animal at once, the 5-inch guns punching at distance, while the rapid-fire Bofors write white ladders toward the sky. Bush's first attackers fall away trailing smoke, the crews cheering in flashes that die in their throats as new planes roar in. Suicide attacks are in odd grammar. There is no jink at the last second, no pull-up to try again. There is only the irrevocable line. On Bush, the first to get through, smashes into the superstructure just aft of the bridge. Fire jets across painted steel. Shrapnel takes the place of air. Damage control parties run through smoke blind, their hands leading them along hot bulkheads as the second kamikaze arrives, then the third. After the second hit, Bush is listing, her decks a geometry of chaos. After the third, she breaks. The sea swallows her with the finality of a slammed door, and the lookout who seconds before was watching the next plane become a black cross against the sun is in the water, arms useless, a life jacket holding him where the Navy once did. The destroyer USS Colhoun meets a similar fate that day, attacked so often that the ship seems to disappear beneath a column of fire. When survivors speak later, they will talk about the heat, the sudden cold, and the immediacy with which men become weight. Into that maelstrom step the small ships, the little ones whose names never made posters. The LCS gunboats and LSM rocket craft, tiny by comparison and fearless by necessity, sprint toward burning destroyers to haul men out of oil slicks exploded into rainbows by gasoline. They carry their own scars. Rocket ships, loaded with racks upon racks of munitions for shore bombardment, are tinder if struck. And on these days, some of them become comets. The crews know, and they do not turn away. Closer to Okinawa, the sweepers work the channels. The destroyer minesweepers Rodman and Emmons have spent their days scouring the waters for mines, slow and deliberate work under a sullen sky. On April 6th, they come under attack, and it feels like a personal betrayal by the air. Planes arrive singly and in pairs, most of them low, hugging the water to evade radar and the eyes of the gunners. Rodman is hit and burning. Emmons comes alongside to help and finds herself marked. 5 kamikazes strike Emmons in as many minutes. The ship survives the moment as a shape of fire, riddled through, still moving, because movement is the only option. She is so damaged that friendly forces scuttle her the next day, a mercy that tastes like defeat. Overhead, the fighter screen is a river in reverse, flowing outward from the fleet to meet the threat, and then backward with damaged planes, or not at all. From fast carriers, F-6F Hellcats and F-4U Corsairs slash through the flocks of inbound aircraft. The air war is as intimate as it is vast. Pilots call splash as targets fall. They shout warnings as a single zero drops out of a cloud with suicidal patience. On Okinawa, American fighter squadrons already operating from freshly hacked runways stumble into the rotation, their pilots returning to muddy tents and shower lines that still have dirt in them from the bulldozer's last pass. Up in the flight direction spaces of the picket destroyers, young officers with headphones glued to their ears vector fighters by bearing, speed, and height. Angels 5, target at 11 o'clock, range 12. Their pencils make grooves in paper. They know that any plane they miss becomes a sailor's last sight. On the Japanese fields in Kyushu, the empty fuel drums pile in the corners. A pilot named Kenji, his name is common enough to be safe, his presence real enough to be representative, wrote to his family in neat, upright characters the night before. "It is spring, Mother. The cherry tree by the gate must bloom. I hope you have enough rice." The sins he confesses are small, the hopes large. He ties the white hachimaki around his head. He is not a fanatic. He is 20. He has peers who expect much, and a state that expects more, and he has been told that his death will be purposeful. He climbs into an aircraft that an earlier era of war would not have sent into battle. In the cockpit, the world becomes discipline and checklists. At the runway's end, there are mechanics who will jump aside at the last second, who will watch with something that is not quite envy and not quite relief. The flight departs into history with a roar, into a sky where the opposition has more fuel, more planes, and more pilots who will see tomorrow. By late afternoon, the anchorage off Okinawa is a quilt of wakes and smoke screens. Naval gunfire support ships, battleships with names from earlier wars. Cruisers that still smell like black powder have become hedgehogs of anti-aircraft fire. Out in that bright fury, an aircraft drops through the canopy, finds a gap, and points its nose at the nearest big shape it can reach. It is not always precision. Sometimes a kamikaze hits the water short and skips like a stone into a hull. Sometimes a wing catches the lip of a carrier as deck and cartwheels the rest of the plane into the sea. Sometimes the aim is perfect. On April 6th and into the following day, ships of all classes pay for the seconds when statistics become reality. There is the hospital ship that does not get hit, but feels the concussion of a nearby crash through all her decks. The nurses clinging to bulkheads as the lights flicker. There is the ammunition ship that lives inside a permanent cloud of fear. If she dies, she will take a piece of the harbor with her. There are the transports where young soldiers sit on packs and listen to the gunfire and do the math of risk, which is to say, they pretend there is no math at all. By nightfall on the 6th, with the water glimmering like spilled oil, and the smell of it in everyone's clothes, the first Kikusui waves have spent themselves, and the defenders have learned how terrible and how survivable this new day can be. Many attackers have been shot down. Many have not made it past the pickets or the cap, but the cost is immediate. Destroyers have sunk. Others are scarred and limping, their bridges stripped of paint, their medical corpsmen more important than their gunners. The Navy has absorbed the largest coordinated suicide assault it has ever known, and it knows there will be more tomorrow. The crewmen fold their hands for chow, with black grime in the creases of their knuckles. Their faces are cut and sunburned. They do not talk much. The sky briefly holds stars. What is new and sure about April 6 is not only the number of planes sent, but the certainty with which so many of them were dedicated to the act. For months, ships had been hit by aircraft piloted by men prepared to die. Here, the scale amplifies what was already brutal into a tactic that threatens to change the shape of the war at sea. In the wardroom, an officer pours coffee into a tin mug and watches it slop over the rim with the ship's motion. He thinks about the map of Kyushu, the little dots of airfields, the arrows he saw on the intel brief that morning. He thinks about how far he is from anywhere. He does not think about whether this is sustainable. He knows it has to be. The second day dawns stern and bright, a kind of light that erases the horizon and blurs distances. Somewhere well to the north, at the edge of reach, the largest battleship ever built is making her last sortie. Yamato, the steel expression of a vanished doctrine, has been sent on a mission that is also a gesture. A dash from the inland sea to Okinawa, with only enough fuel for a one-way trip and with orders to beach, herself as a fixed gun battery, if she cannot survive the journey. The plan, conceived under the same pressure as Kikusui, marries surface audacity to aerial sacrifice. While hundreds more kamikazes go south, the pride of the fleet goes with them. American reconnaissance picks up the movement. The response is automatic in its scale. From the decks of the fast carriers of Task Force 58, dozens, then hundreds of planes launch, the air roped with contrails as they find altitude and angle, and the long legs that will carry them to the target. Dive bombers and torpedo planes lean into their work. Hellcats take station as guard dogs. The Yamato and her escorts fight back with everything they have: flak that tears the sky, and the kind of stubbornness that looks like calm. Within a few hours, both sides have written their last messages in iron and fire. Bombs drive into deck armor designed for a previous age. Torpedoes find their home below the waterline. Yamato capsizes under the weight of her own dream, her hull rolling toward the sun in a scene so vast it seems mythic. She explodes, and where she was, there is only a roiling scar of ocean. Thousands of Japanese sailors die within minutes. The task force turns back toward its screen and its carriers. The news flashes through the command network like a tonic and a sadness. The greatest of their surface threats has been erased. The sky remains. While that drama plays out, ships off Okinawa face the steady pressure of the second day of Kikusui. The strike that hits the carrier USS Hancock is a single plane in the middle of a labyrinth of others, and it proves that the distance between almost and disaster is measured in feet. The Kamikaze crashes on her flight deck, the explosion throwing shrapnel and burning fuel across men who 5 minutes earlier were pushing planes, riding the deck's movements as if it were a living thing. The fire spreads fast. Flight deck crews respond with the insane calm of practice, throwing foam and sand, dragging hosed lines through heat that shrivels their eyebrows, pushing damaged aircraft over the side. The ship lives because every ship in the U.S. fleet is also a fire department. She resumes operations before the day is out, her deck patched, her pride collective and unspoken. At the beaches, the invasion sinews stretch. Tanks and trucks crawl through ash and coral. Inland, soldiers move past empty villages and into fortifications that were built for sieges. Offshore, the Navy is both shield and a target too large to miss. The anchorages boil with activity. Supply ships unloading mountains of ammunition and food. Repair ships turning wreckage back into weapons. Hospital ships bearing the wounded to operating rooms that are relentless but clean. At Karama-Reto, the sheltered anchorage behind Okinawa, the Navy has carved out a sanctuary for battered hulls to rest, their wounds wrapped in temporary patches of steel and determination. The sanctuary is an illusion the Japanese strain to break with Meade submarines, night raids, and small suicide boats. That they sometimes succeed is less important than the constant absence of quiet. Between April 6th and 7th, the U.S. Navy keeps its fighters in the air with almost mathematical precision. Flight decks are choreographed. Landings, refuelings, rearmings, takeoffs, and then again. The CICs on destroyers and cruisers hum with calm voices, vectors, corrections, and minute adjustments that add up to lives. Down in those compartments, lit by low wattage bulbs and covered in grease pencil lines, the smell of coffee is now a permanent part of the air. A young officer remembers, later, how his ear would ring for hours after he took the headset off, the silence heavier than sound. In the days that follow, because the largest attack is not merely a day, but an opening movement, the shape of this air war clarifies through extremes. On April 12th, the rocket-assisted bomb glider the Americans have learned to fear shows what it can do. An Ohka cherry blossom is dropped from a bomber and ignites its rocket motor in a dash too fast for most guns to track. The destroyer Manert El Abil is struck and broken, sinking swiftly as her crew fights where they stand. The weapon is an evolution of desperation, astonishing in its speed, terrifying for the bell it tolls. On April 16th, at a bleak, isolating radar picket station, a destroyer named Laffey refuses to die. 22 planes come for her in one attack, a mix of conventional bombers and kamikazes, and the axes of air and sea cross directly over her deck. She takes hits you can count on fingers and toes, bombs and direct rams, and responds with a kind of institutional stubbornness. Gun crews keep firing with bandages on their faces. Damage control teams beat back fires with the exhaustion of men who understand that when the water reaches a certain point, it owns them. The ship is left blackened, torn, and alive. Her nickname, the ship that would not die, is not a boast. It is a diagnosis. These episodes sit around the initial avalanche of April 6th to 7th like explanatory notes. The largest concerted day made clear what was coming, and these days filled in the range of it. The picket line, far out and lonely, will bear the brunt. The Navy has pushed its hands forward to feel what is coming, and the enemy now concentrates on cutting fingers. The carriers, targets too valuable not to aim at, keep fighting with decks scarred and crews strapped to their duties with the cords of habit and belief. The battleships and cruisers stand in the posture of old gods, wrapped in thunder, vital and increasingly aware that the shape of this war will be remembered for other things. Somewhere in southern Kyushu, in a small home that smells of tatami and dust, a mother boils rice that is more water than grain and waits for a letter that will later become a shard of museum glass. In a house in Iowa or Georgia, a family sits at a kitchen table while a Western Union man clears his throat at the door. At sea, men and boys try to keep their hands busy and their minds slow. They play cards on ammunition crates in corners that are loud and bright, and then they jump to their stations with cards still warm in their palms. The first Kikusui has done its work. It has sunk destroyers and gunboats and damaged larger ships. It has bloodied a fleet and shown it what resolve looks like from the other side. The numbers of planes shot down by American fighters and flak are staggering. The sea is thick with their debris. But for all the fallen attackers, a few get through when it matters, and those few can matter a great deal. The lesson is brutally simple. Keep the picket line intact. Keep the fighter cover thick. Keep the guns loaded. Do this every hour of every day until the island is secured and the logic of suicidal attack loses its last purchase. The days after the opening assault are a grim sort of endurance test, a contest in which the side that can maintain the same level of attention longest will prevail. Kikusui continues as a series. The first largest wave on April 6th to 7th, followed by others less numerous individually, but in sum, relentless through April and May. Each operation launches hundreds more aircraft into a sky increasingly ruled by a practiced defense, and each inflicts its moments of catastrophe despite that skill. The radar picket stations evolve into small kingdoms of mutual aid and quiet dread. Destroyers rotate through their assignments with the regularity of ships' clocks, but some stations, the outer ones closest to Kyushu, develop reputations like haunted houses. Sailors can tell where they are by the particular way the sea looks in the morning and by the shape of the distant clouds. Small gunships LCSS and LSM, Rs, the mighty midgets of the line, fill around the larger ships like remras around sharks. Their presence both an act of protection and an admission that even a destroyer needs friends. Fighter direction officers on these pickets become minor celebrities. Their voices known to pilots who will never see their faces. Their timing and judgment, the difference between an intercept and a funeral. Despite the best work of pilots and gunners, some days open with black plumes and close with chaplains speaking over the wake. On May 3rd to 4th, the 5th Kikusui batters the fleet in a way that feels personal. The air is thick with engine noise and the acrid line of rocket smoke. Rocket ships at the picket line, laden with fuel and more explosive charge than prudence endorses, become torches when struck. A destroyer burns as if turned inside out, flames scavenging every store of oxygen, even a man's breath. Crews fight with hoses and with shovels, throwing sand, using their bodies to block the spread of fire as if they are more barrier than flesh. The historians will later tally ships sunk and damaged, but the men who were there count by faces. The fast carriers, the American fleet's beating heart, continued to absorb strikes while maintaining sortie rates that beg belief. Damage control, those two words that mean everything at sea, becomes an art and a calling. On May 11th, 2 Kamikazes slam into the Essex-class carrier Bunker Hill. A first plows across her deck and detonates among fueled and armed aircraft. The second arrives moments later, an act of cruel layering. Fire engulfs the ship in seconds, the heat driving men to jump overboard into water already slick with fuel. The crew fights the blaze with a fury that is functionally love. Love of shipmates, of ship, of seeing the sun again. Hundreds of sailors die that day. The carrier survives. The price paid is immediate and long-lasting, a roll of names that will hang in the air for years. On May 14th, the storied carrier Enterprise, a veteran of battles that defined the Pacific War, takes a hit from a kamikaze that dives out of a cloud and finds the only exposed thing that matters. The explosion shudders her. Sparks leap across metal like fireflies turned angry, and yet she too will return to the tasks at hand. This is the grim arithmetic of Okinawa. The Americans possess resilience in depth repair ships, spare parts, trained replacement crews, and the kamikaze attacks strike at that resilience like a hammer on stone, hoping for fractures. South of Okinawa, the British Pacific Fleet, operating as Task Force 57, appears in a theater that had once been dominated by American silhouettes. Their mission is to suppress airfields on the Sakishima Gonto, to blunt the flow of kamikazes from the south. British carriers armored-decked and stoic take hits and keep moving. HMS Indefatigable is struck on April 1st. HMS Formidable is hit in May, her armored flight deck scorched and twisted, her pilot's readiness measured not just in skill but in stubbornness. The British experience the kamikaze's shock and find their own answers in steel and training. They are an additional weight on the scales, and their presence matters. In this same period, the Japanese Army and Navy Air Forces continue to launch. Supplies dwindle. Training hours are reduced to thready minimums. Mechanics coax life out of engines that would have been scrapped a year earlier. Airfields on Kyushu become open graves for aircraft that cannot leave, decoys dotting their perimeters to soak up the Americans' iron rain. The command echelons in Japan keep count and keep faith. Vice Admiral Ugaki urges on his squadrons and will later choose to fly one last mission after hearing of the Emperor's decision to end the war, a personal coda to a campaign that fed men into the sky. The sailor's world reduces to the next watch and the next alarm. Sleep is a commodity, food an afterthought. There are smells that will never be forgotten. Burnt cordite, salt, the sourness of fear. There are sounds that become the background score, the steady chop of propellers, the angry hornet buzz of incoming engines, the slam of watertight doors that somehow is reassuring because it means routines are intact. Chaplains and doctors move like necessary ghosts through this world. They write letters in longhand to families they will never meet. They rinse blood from surgeries with water, so warm it is no longer a shock. For all the attacks and the deaths, the defense holds. By the time Okinawa's battle winds toward its brutal end on land, fighting across ridgelines with names that taste like dust, the sea battle has settled into grim repetition. Cap fighters intercept the majority of inbound attackers. Flak throws up its lethal lattice. Pickets call out vectors with voices hoarse from use. And still some planes get through, and still they do terrible things. And still the fleet moves its supplies and shells inland and carries the wounded homeward. By the end, the statistics are a kind of rough poetry. Over the course of the Okinawa campaign, the Japanese will launch more than 1,000 kamikaze sorties in organized waves and additional smaller attacks. The U.S. Navy will lose dozens of ships' destroyers, destroyer escorts, minesweepers, smaller craft, or see them so damaged that their fighting lives effectively end. Hundreds more will be scarred. More than 4,000 American sailors will die at sea in this campaign, a number greater than any other battle of the war for the Navy. The Japanese will lose most of the pilots they send, and much of the slender aviation capacity they still possess. Neither side emerges from the sea as they were before. Those numbers, however, are scaffolding. The structure they hold is human and precise. At a picket station at dusk, a bosun's mate leans against the rail and watches islands bruise purple under the setting sun. He can smell dinner-canned meat, coffee, a sweetness that might be peaches if the galley has been generous. His ears ring. His hands shake if he lets them. He closes his eyes and sees the curve of a wing, the bright pinpoint of a tracer walking toward it. He hears, somewhere deep in his skull, a man shout the alarm. He opens his eyes. The sea is still here. The next watch is soon. When it is over, the battle shifts inland. The 10th Army moves forward in agony, taking ridges at a price that is both precise and incomprehensible. At sea, the anchors come up at last. Repair ships finish their work and turn toward Saipan and Ulithi. The picket stations are dismantled like circus tents, leaving behind coordinates that will forever mean danger to the men who man them. The great floating city of the American fleet draws down its tents and moves away, leaving Okinawa, a place that will never again be just an island on a map. The largest kamikaze attack ever mounted did not stop the invasion it meant to halt. It did not break the fleet it meant to fracture. But it did something we are still living with. It forced a reconsideration of what it means to fight at sea when killing the enemy is less important than stopping him. It underscored the necessity of layered defense, of early warning and fast interception, of fire control systems that can track a human while bent on hitting steel. After Okinawa, the arc of naval thought bends toward capabilities that are now so embedded we barely notice them. Integrated air defense, missiles that think for themselves, ships that bristle with radars. The modern picket line is a constellation of sensors. The modern destroyer carries an architecture of numbers rather than paper and grease pencil. The roots of that architecture lay on desks and in compartments off Okinawa, where young men fought the sky with math and grit. For Japan, the choice to commit so many of its remaining pilots to certain death was born of circumstances we can name losses, shortages, political imperatives, and of a culture in which sacrifice had meanings not easily translated. It is too simple to see fanaticism and stop. The letters left by the young men who flew will break your heart if you let them. They are filled not with hate, but with love, with apologies to parents and promises to siblings. This does not make the tactic less brutal, or the destruction less aimless. It makes it human. The kamikaze's impact on American sailors was equally human. Many would carry wounds you can see, and some you cannot. They would stand in rooms years later and startle at the sound of a dropped pan. They would flinch when engines backfired. They would tell their children stories with the edges worn off, taking out the worst and leaving in the courage, because that was the part they knew how to share. The casualties on both sides built pressure in decisions making their way to the highest levels. The cost at Okinawa on land and sea sits in the chain of reasoning that would lead Allied leaders to consider weapons that promised finality. The kamikaze did not cause the atomic bombs. The war's machinery was larger and older than any single tactic. But the fact of sailors watching planes turn into fire, day after day, is part of the mood of 1945, a mood in which the appetite for more amphibious invasions had been thoroughly eaten away. When people recall the end of the war, the grand speeches and the mushroom clouds, there is a sliver of that memory that smells like gasoline and salt water. Today, artifacts of those days point toward meaning. In Charleston, South Carolina, the USS Laffey sits as a museum ship, her decks quiet and her guns silent, a steel canvas for the story of a day when she refused to leave. In Baton Rouge, Louisiana, the USS Kidd, another veteran of picket duty and air attack, rests with her waterline matching the river's moods, her compartments preserved with the simplicity of a ship waiting to cast off. In Kagoshima Prefecture, the Shiran Peace Museum holds photographs of young men adjusting their headbands, of bicycles leaning against airfield huts, of faces that look both determined and very young. Visitors stand in front of glass cases and read letters on paper so thin it is almost translucent. They understand, maybe for the first time, how a war that seems like numbers is made of particulars. In the history of the U.S. Navy, Okinawa remains a pivot. Nowhere else did the Navy lose so many ships to air attack in so short a span. Nowhere else did the phrase radar picket carry such a weight of sorrow and pride. To walk the decks of a surviving destroyer and run your hand along the rivets is to touch the echo of an engine order bell clanging, as a helmsman spun a wheel to unmask a gun of a chief petty officer, shouting through a mouthful of smoke of a corpsman leaning over a friend in sickbay, with the understanding that heroism sometimes looks like steady hands in silence. War is not abstract to those who did its work. The largest kamikaze attack ever was an expression of a nation's extremity and of individual choices made within it. The defense was an expression of another nation's industrial power and of sailorly stubbornness. It was an intersection of cultures in the worst possible place, and it led not to glory, but to a kind of endurance we should be careful not to romanticize. We can admire courage without loving what it was used for. We can honor the dead without lying about why they died. And there is something else to do. Take up a book of letters, go aboard a preserved ship, walk beneath the low ceilings, and think about what it means to live inside a piece of history. Put your palm on cool steel. Read names. Imagine April light on a metallic sea. The distance of years can make us forget that the men on both sides inhabited a present that felt as immediate as ours does. The story of when the U.S. Navy faced the largest kamikaze attack ever is not only a record of tactics and losses. It is an invitation to inhabit that immediacy long enough to carry something forward, an insistence that choices matter, that technology answers only some questions, and that memory is a kind of work. If we do that work, the ghosts get company, and the long roar of the Pacific in 1945 becomes, for a moment, a human voice.